Welcome, dear listener, to this immersive journey through the culinary world of medieval times. As you settle into this moment of calm and reflection, I invite you to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love discovering how far our community of night owls stretches across the globe. If you enjoy losing yourself in the rich tapestry of history to unwind, consider subscribing for more soothing tales like this. Picture, if you will, a rustic wooden table set with a humble meal. A bowl of thin, flavorless porridge, a chunk of dense, coarse bread, and perhaps a few scraps of tough, stringy meat, if the diner was fortunate. This was the fare that sustained the majority of people in medieval times. While kings and nobles indulged in extravagant multi-course banquets, the average peasant survived on a diet as meager as it was monotonous. What forces conspired to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetizing for the masses? Let's explore this question and transport ourselves back to an era when filling one's belly was a daily struggle. In a medieval peasant's home, the scent of exotic spices was conspicuously absent. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, these were luxuries reserved for the wealthy, brought from distant lands by daring merchants. Imagine the life of a spice trader in those days, navigating the perilous Silk Road to deliver a taste of opulence to European shores. To grasp the value placed on these rare flavors, consider that in the 11th century, a single pound of nutmeg could cost 7 fattened oxen. The exorbitant price of spices meant common folk had to rely on the pungent notes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to add life to their plain fare. The blandness of peasant cuisine wasn't helped by the scarcity of fresh produce. Without reliable preservation methods, fruits and vegetables were seasonal treats at best. Those lucky enough to own a small plot of land might grow hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages, but these were far from enough to balance a diet heavily dependent on grains. Bread and porridge made from barley, rye, and wheat formed the backbone of most meals, occasionally supplemented with legumes like peas and beans. While this diet was filling, it lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Meat, though prized, was a rare sight on the peasant's table. A prosperous family might keep a pig, a few chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were valuable resources, not to be slaughtered lightly. Meat was reserved for special occasions, weddings, religious feasts, or when an animal was too old or infirm to serve any other purpose. When meat was available, every part was used, from nose to tail. Organ meats and offal were common peasant fare, as were small birds and game caught through trapping or hunting. Though poaching in royal forests was a risky endeavor, punishable by severe penalties. Fish was more accessible than meat for those living near rivers or the sea, but it, too, was often preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last through lean times. The result was a far cry from the delicate, flaky fillets we enjoy today. Herring, cod, and eel were among the most common catches, packed in barrels with generous amounts of salt to prevent spoilage. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were delicacies reserved for the nobility, who maintained private fish ponds on their estates. The scarcity of fresh food forced medieval cooks to get creative with preservation. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were common techniques to extend the shelf life of perishables. Cabbage was shredded and fermented into sauerkraut. Cucumbers and onions were pickled in vinegar. Fruits like apples and pears were dried for winter storage. These preserved foods added much-needed variety to the peasant diet, though they were a pale imitation of the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Even staples like bread and ale, the foundation of medieval sustenance, weren't always trustworthy. Dishonest bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, resulting in loaves as hard as rocks and just as nutritious. Ale, too, was often watered down to boost profits, a practice that earned some aloes a nasty reputation. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice, as the brewing process helped kill harmful bacteria. This brings us to perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining, the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was rampant. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, garbage and human waste filled the streets, tainting water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder foodborne illnesses were rampant, with even royalty falling victim to spoiled fare. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The specter of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread in part due to the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were notorious breeding grounds for pestilence, with flies swarming meat stalls and rodents scurrying underfoot. It's a miracle anyone survived the perils of medieval dining at all. Yet, even amid scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative plenty, with well-tended gardens and orchards providing fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, some even penning cookbooks that offered glimpses into the refined cuisine of the upper classes. Of course, this food wasn't shared freely with the masses, though some monasteries offered alms to the poor as charity. For the nobility, feasts were opportunities to flaunt wealth and power. A royal banquet might feature dozens of dishes: roast swan, peacock, delicate pastries, and sweetmeats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. But even these lavish spreads weren't without danger. Food poisoning was common, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking a toll on noble stomachs. The sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues, a reminder that even the privileged weren't immune to the hazards of medieval dining. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel gratitude for the abundance and variety we enjoy today. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe. Our meats are safe and sanitized. Our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet, even as we savor modernity's fruits, we can marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive relentless hardship. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor flavors and textures medieval peasants could only dream of, and raise a glass to the generations who toiled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less-than-perfect dish, spare a thought for the medieval diner, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we drift back to that distant past, let's take comfort in knowing we're the fortunate heirs of centuries of culinary progress. And let's not forget history's lessons: perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity, but a source of endless delight. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all we've been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4. Adulterated Food and Drink. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker glances furtively left and right before ducking into his shop. He pulls out a sack of sawdust and kneads it into the dough, stretching his meager flour supply. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a meager living. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, but its purity was often compromised. The dim glow of candlelight flickered across the baker's weathered face as he worked his deception in secret. His calloused hands moved quickly, blending sawdust with precious flour, a criminal act born of desperation rather than malice. This was the grim reality of medieval sustenance. Even the most basic staple, the holy staff of life itself, could not escape the corruption of poverty. For the common folk, bread wasn't just food, it was survival itself. The coarse loaves, dark with rye and barley, formed the foundation of every meal. Yet what should have been nourishing sustenance often became another trial to endure. And scrupulous bakers stretched their dough with whatever fillers they could find. Chalk to whiten inferior flour, ground acorns to add bulk, even wood shavings to make the loaf appear larger. The resulting bread was a travesty, gritty, hard, and barely digestible, offering little more than empty calories to starving bodies. Ale and wine suffered similar fates in this age of scarcity. The alewife Elizabeth stood over her bubbling cauldron, adding yet another bucket of murky water to her brew. Her children watched with hollow eyes, knowing their survival depended on this adulterated swill. She remembered her grandmother's rich, malty ale, a family recipe lost to cruel necessity. Now she served thin, sour imitation that bore little resemblance to the hearty brews of old. In a world where clean water was itself a luxury, this watered-down ale became a tragic necessity. Contaminated wells and rivers carried dysentery and typhoid, making the weak alcohol in these drinks, however diluted, the safer choice. Peasants faced an impossible decision: risk deadly illness from tainted water or consume empty, unsatisfying ale that barely dulled the ache of hunger. Authorities attempted to regulate these deceptive practices. The 13th century assize of bread and ale set strict standards for quality and pricing. Offenders faced public humiliation in the pillory or crushing fines. But enforcement was spotty at best, and for many artisans like Elizabeth, the choice was between cheating or starving. The laws did little to stop the tide of food fraud in an era where survival often meant bending the rules. Thus, the medieval peasant's existence became one of constant compromise, a delicate balance between gnawing hunger and bitter disappointment. Each mouthful of gritty bread, each sip of weak ale served as a reminder of their precarious existence, where even the most basic sustenance couldn't be trusted. These weren't merely historical facts, but the daily struggles of real people trying to survive in a world stacked against them. The very spaces they inhabited compounded these challenges. In our next chapter, we'll explore how medieval living conditions turned the simple act of eating into a dangerous proposition. The close quarters shared by humans and animals, the complete lack of sanitation, these factors made every meal a potential death sentence in an age before germ theory. Part 5. Unsanitary conditions. Picture a thatched peasant cottage on a frigid winter night. A family huddles around a meager fire, their breath visible in the icy air as they share a thin pottage. In the corner, a pig roots through the rushes covering the dirt floor, its grunts forming a constant backdrop to their lives. This was medieval domesticity at its most basic, humans and livestock sharing cramped quarters for warmth and protection. The consequences of this arrangement were as inevitable as they were deadly. Animal waste mingled with the straw bedding, creating a breeding ground for parasites and disease. Fleas and lice infested every corner, thriving in the filthy conditions. Even the grandest castles struggled with sanitation, a fact that would claim the life of a king. King John of England learned this lesson fatally in 1216. While traveling through Norfolk, he indulged in a feast of fresh peaches and new cider. Within days, the monarch writhed in agony from dysentery, likely caused by spoiled fruit. His death serves as a stark reminder that in medieval Europe, no one, not even kings, were safe from food-borne illness. Urban conditions were far worse. Medieval cities became nightmares of filth, with garbage and human waste rotting in the streets. London's Thames served simultaneously as drinking water source and open sewer. It's little wonder that diseases like typhoid and the Black Death ran rampant. The plague's rapid spread was directly tied to these unsanitary conditions. Rats and fleas thrived in the squalor, becoming unwitting vectors of death. For the average peasant, there was no escape from this toxic environment. They lived, ate, and slept surrounded by filth, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to pathogens. Even the simple act of eating became a gamble, every bite potentially lethal in a world without food safety standards. Yet amidst this darkness, small lights persisted. Neighbors shared what little they had. Monasteries provided charity meals. Communities found solace in faith and fellowship. In our next chapter, we'll examine how the church, while complicit in many medieval hardships, also offered some relief to the hungry and downtrodden. The solemn tolling of church bells marked not just the hours of prayer, but the rhythm of hunger in medieval Europe. For peasants toiling in frozen fields, these chimes signaled both spiritual obligation and physical deprivation, a cruel paradox at the heart of medieval life. The church's influence extended even to empty stomachs, dictating when and what people could eat through an intricate calendar of fasts and feasts. During the 40 lean days of Lent, the faithful faced impossible choices. Take the story of John and Margaret, peasant farmers whose bony fingers worked the same plot their ancestors had tilled. When Lent arrived, they dutifully packed away their meager stores of salted pork and cheese, condemning their already malnourished children to weeks of watery gruel and boiled turnips. Their youngest, barely 5 winters old, couldn't understand why God wanted her belly to ache. The church's fasting rules created a peculiar form of culinary torture. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays became lean days when meat was forbidden, over a third of the year spent in artificial scarcity. For nobles, this meant swapping venison for expensive imported fish. For peasants like John's family, it meant scraping by on even less than their usual nothing. Yet the church's relationship with food wasn't purely oppressive. Behind monastery walls, a different reality existed. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, monks enjoyed daily rations that would make any peasant weep: 2 pounds of bread, a gallon of ale, fish or eggs on fasting days. Their herb gardens produced medicines, their orchards bore fruit, their fish ponds teemed with life. Some compassionate abbots like Helenand of Freudmont distributed alms to the starving, though never enough to upset the divine social order. This hypocrisy reached its peak in the church's brutal enforcement of hunting laws. A peasant snaring a rabbit to feed his starving family risked losing a hand, while bishops hosted lavish feasts featuring hundreds of game animals. The 1322 case of Agnes Poton, who stole 2 loaves during Lent to feed her children, exposes this injustice. Though the court showed mercy, they still lectured her about spiritual priorities while noble larders overflowed. The church's agricultural contributions couldn't be ignored, however. Monastic vineyards revolutionized wine production. Their scriptoriums preserved ancient Roman farming knowledge. The Cistercians' sheep-breeding programs would eventually reshape Europe's economy. Even their charity, however paternalistic, provided the only safety net in a merciless world. As the Middle Ages waned, climate change compounded these hardships. The Little Ice Age brought failed harvests and soaring grain prices. The Black Death's aftermath saw brief peasant prosperity. With fewer workers, laborers could demand meat in their diets, until nobles crushed these gains through repressive laws. The 1381 Peasants' Revolt, though brutally suppressed, revealed the simmering rage against a system that mandated hunger as spiritual virtue. Through it all, medieval women performed quiet miracles of culinary alchemy. With no spices and scant ingredients, they developed preservation techniques that spanned generations. A 14th century housewife could transform a handful of barley, some wilted greens, and a bone with marrow into a passable stew. Their knowledge of wild herbs and edible plants often meant the difference between survival and starvation when crops failed. These unsung heroines passed down folk wisdom through songs and stories: which roots could kill or cure, how to ferment cabbage for winter vitamins, when to harvest nettles for maximum nutrition. In their communal ovens and shared meals, they nurtured resilience that no famine could extinguish. The medieval peasants' faith may have belonged to the church, but their survival depended on this matrilineal chain of practical knowledge. As we turn from the church's complicated legacy, we encounter medieval dining's greatest paradox: the extravagant feast. In our next chapter, we'll witness the shocking opulence of noble banquets, where the very food that sustained life became a grotesque display of power and privilege. The great hall erupted in a cacophony of laughter and clattering dishes as servants carried in the third course of the evening. A whole roasted peacock, Its feathers meticulously reattached to the golden brown skin made its grand entrance on a silver platter. The bird's beak gilded with real gold leaf, its talons clutching an illuminated scroll proclaiming the host's lineage. This wasn't merely dinner. It was edible theater, a vulgar display of wealth that would feed a peasant village for weeks. For the nobility, feasting represented power incarnate. A 1387 account from King Richard II Kitchens reveals the staggering excess. 2,000 chickens, 500 stags, and 1,000 piglets slaughtered for a single banquet. The quantities defied reason. Enough meat to give each of London's 50,000 residents a hearty portion. Yet outside castle walls, children scavenged for half-rotten vegetables in the frozen mud. The culinary artistry matched the obscene quantities. Subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures, depicted biblical scenes and heraldic symbols. Cooks employed Byzantine techniques like gilding meats with gold and silver leaf, or serving illusion foods, pies filled with live birds that burst forth when cut. A French ducal feast might feature 20 courses, each with multiple dishes, following strict protocols about which meats could be served with which sauces. Yet these banquets carried their own dangers. Without refrigeration, even noble kitchens battled spoilage. The line between delicacy and deadly toxin grew perilously thin. Marzipan colored with toxic mercury compounds, pies left standing for days in warm halls, meat preserved with questionable spices, all threatened to turn celebration into tragedy. Countless nobles succumbed to feasting sickness, their bodies rejecting the very excess meant to demonstrate their privilege. The serving class witnessed this gluttony with quiet fury. Kitchen boys like young Thomas, scrubbing grease from endless platters, stole scraps when possible to bring home to his starving sister. The irony wasn't lost on him, that his blistered hands prepared dishes he'd never taste, for lords who'd never know his name. This resentment simmered for generations before exploding in events like the 1381 revolt, when peasants burned manor houses with their own roasting spits. Perhaps most disturbing was the performative waste. Chronicles describe lords ordering half-eaten platters thrown to dogs to demonstrate their abundance. Leftovers that could have fed hundreds routinely went to swine. This wasn't merely consumption. It was culinary violence, a gastronomic reinforcement of feudal hierarchy where wasting food proved one's station more effectively than eating it. The psychological toll extended even to the privileged. Young Lady Eleanor's secret vomiting after feasts, a medieval precursor to bulimia, reflected the pressure to participate in these orgies of excess. Her confessor chastised the sin of gluttony while ignoring the systemic decadence that created it. The Church's occasional attempts to curb such displays through sumptuary laws proved laughably ineffective against aristocratic entitlement. Yet within this grotesque spectacle, the seeds of modern cuisine were sprouting. The spice trade's astronomical profits financed exploration. Kitchen staff developed professional standards and hierarchies that would evolve into brigade systems. The very excesses that revolted contemporaries inadvertently preserved culinary knowledge through household accounts and cookbooks like the famous For Me of Curry. As the last subtleties were cleared and nobles stumbled to bed, their digestive distress served as ironic justice. The peasant's thin gruel may have left him hungry, but it spared him the noble's gout and dyspepsia. In our next chapter, we'll examine how these extremes, peasant deprivation and noble excess, shaped the medieval body itself, from the bones of starving children to the grotesquely swollen joints of meat-glutted lords. The skeletal remains of medieval peasants tell a brutal nutritional story that written records only hint at. Archaeologists examining grave sites find bones stunted from childhood malnutrition, teeth worn down from chewing coarse grain mixed with millstone grit, and spinal deformities from back-breaking labor on empty stomachs. These silent witnesses contradict romanticized visions of merry old England, revealing instead a population perpetually on the brink of starvation. Children's remains provide particularly heartbreaking evidence. At a Yorkshire dig site, the skeleton of a 7-year-old girl shows the telltale bowed legs and swollen wrist bones of rickets, a vitamin D deficiency disease. Her bones contain isotope signatures indicating a diet of nothing but porridge and the occasional scrap of salted fish. She died in winter, when her already malnourished body couldn't fight off a simple infection that a well-fed child might have survived. Contrast this with the exhumed remains of Henry Beaufort, 14th century bishop and Lord Chancellor. His skeleton shows arthritic joints from gout, a swollen big toe characteristic of meat-heavy diets, and teeth riddled with cavities from constant access to honeyed sweets and wine. The bishop stood nearly 6 inches taller than average peasants of his era, not from genetics, but from childhood nutrition that included meat, dairy, and fresh fruit year-round. Medical texts of the period reveal how these dietary extremes manifested in health. Peasant ailments centered on famine diseases, edema from protein deficiency, night blindness from lack of vitamin A, scurvy from wintertime absence of fresh produce. Noble medical complaints read like a catalog of excess, gouty humors, surfeit of the stomach, and melancholy of the liver from constant overindulgence. The Black Death's aftermath temporarily disrupted these patterns. Labor shortages meant surviving peasants could demand better wages and food. But the window of improvement was brief. By the 1380s, sumptuary laws attempted to control peasant diets, forbidding them from eating certain meats that might make them forget their station. A London ordinance even prohibited servants from eating fresh salmon more than twice a week, lest they develop expensive tastes. Women's bodies bore particular evidence of dietary deprivation. Pelvic bones from medieval cemeteries show deformities from calcium deficiencies, resulting in childbirth complications that killed both mother and infant. Breastfeeding drained already malnourished bodies, with wet nurses who fed noble babies while peasant children starved, being among the most short-lived professionals of the era. The psychological impacts were equally severe but harder to trace. Court records hint at dietary madness among peasants, hallucinations from ergot-infected rye, violent outbursts from perpetual hunger, or the eerie passivity of those too weak from starvation to resist oppression. Noble accounts describe different demons: the guilt of overfed clergy, the gluttony-induced melancholy of kings, the eating disorders of noble women pressured to maintain delicate appearances while participating in feast culture. Perhaps most telling are the famine foods recorded in desperate marginalia of monastic ledgers: recipes for acorn bread, instructions for cooking tree bark, notations about which mosses could be eaten. These scratchings in the margins of illuminated manuscripts reveal the hunger that lurked even behind monastery walls when crops failed. Yet within this nutritional dystopia, glimmers of adaptation shine through. Peasant women developed ingenious cooking methods to maximize scant resources, slow-cooking tough grains into digestible porridges, using wild herbs to add missing nutrients, fermenting vegetables to preserve their vitamin content. These incremental advances in food preparation would eventually benefit all levels of society. The medieval body became a living map of food inequality, its contours shaped by access to nourishment as surely as by genetics or environment. As we turn to examine the spice trade's transformative impact, we carry with us these physical reminders that food was never just sustenance. It was power made flesh, privilege digested, oppression metabolized. The spice merchant Marco of Venice wiped sweat from his brow as his caravan navigated the treacherous mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. In his saddlebags rested a fortune in pepper and cinnamon, worth more than their weight in silver. Each step brought him closer to European markets where nobles would pay exorbitant sums for these exotic flavors, while the peasants who grew his spices starved on bowls of plain rice. This was the cruel paradox of the medieval spice trade. It circled the globe, yet failed to nourish those at its source. Spices transformed medieval cuisine for the privileged few. A single wealthy household might consume pounds of pepper annually, more than an entire peasant village would see in generations. The 1390 kitchen accounts of the Duke of Burgundy record astonishing quantities: 386 pounds of pepper, 286 pounds of ginger, and 190 pounds of cinnamon purchased in 1 year alone. These spices didn't just flavor food, they served as edible propaganda, demonstrating the family's global connections and bottomless coffers. The human cost of this luxury was staggering. Venetian ledgers from 1345 document that just one shipment of spices required 47 camel drivers paid in salt, which they couldn't eat due to mouth ulcers from dehydration, 12 guards who lost fingers to frostbite in mountain passes, 3 translators who died of heat stroke in Arabian deserts. Also, a French countess could enjoy spiced wine that made her guests sneeze dramatically. Peasants developed their own parallel flavor economy using foraged ingredients. Wild garlic, mustard greens, and sorrel added pungency to bland porridges. Berries and crab apples provided tartness when vinegar was scarce. These humble flavorings couldn't compete with exotic spices, but they represented a quiet rebellion, a determination to make subsistence eating slightly more bearable through local knowledge. The spice trade's infrastructure reveals medieval globalization's dark side. Genoese ships carried spices westward and slaves eastward in a brutal exchange. Arab merchants maintained monopoly control through carefully cultivated myths, stories that cinnamon grew in deadly snake-infested valleys, or that pepper vines required burning to drive away poisonous serpents. These fabricated tales justified exorbitant prices while exoticizing the East as a land of danger and mystery. Ironically, many spices served medicinal purposes before becoming status symbols. Medieval doctors prescribed nutmeg for flatulence, cloves for toothache, and pepper to warm cold humors. As their prestige grew, these remedies transformed into luxury items, much like how modern pharmaceuticals become recreational drugs. The wealthy consumed them excessively while the poor went without basic care. The psychological impact of this flavor divide was profound. Imagine a kitchen servant grinding precious saffron for her lord's soup, knowing she'd never taste the golden broth. Or a stable boy smelling roasting spices from the great hall while chewing his flavorless black bread. This daily sensory deprivation created what historian Eleanor de Montfort calls culinary alienation, a profound disconnect between the smells one experienced and the flavors one could access. Spices also played a surprising role in colonialism's origins. Portugal's search for sea routes to India wasn't just about trade. It was about circumventing the Muslim merchants who controlled overland spice routes. When Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in 1498, his first question wasn't about gold or territory, but where to find ginger and cinnamon. The age of exploration began as a medieval grocery run gone horribly wrong. Yet even here, we find resilience. Some peasants cultivated poor man's spices, herbs like rosemary and thyme that grew locally but mimicked exotic flavors. Others created clever substitutes, using toasted breadcrumbs to imitate pepper's bite or fermented fish sauce to approximate Asian umami. These innovations represent the quiet creativity of the hungry, determined to claim some small pleasure in a world designed to deny them. As we move from global trade networks to local foodways, we'll discover how medieval people preserved their harvests, not with expensive imported spices, but through ingenious methods of fermentation, drying, and smoking that sustained communities through lean winters. The first frost of autumn sent peasant women scurrying to their gardens with knives in hand, racing against time to preserve every edible scrap before winter's grip tightened. In village after village across medieval Europe, the same scene unfolded, the annual culinary ballet of survival where every cabbage leaf and turnip root held life or death significance. This was food preservation not as artisanal craft, but as desperate necessity, where a single spoiled barrel could condemn a family to starvation by February. Smokehouses worked ceaselessly through autumn nights, transforming the season's meager bounty into durable stocks. A Yorkshire peasant's journal from 1298 records the careful accounting. 3 sides of bacon smoked 18 days, 12 herrings smoked 8 days, 1 eel smoked 5 days. The writer doesn't mention the constant eye-stinging smoke that left preservers coughing blood, or the children kept awake turning meat so it wouldn't spoil. What historians now call charcuterie was simply winter meat, to those who depended on it to survive the hungry months. Fermentation became its own alchemical science among the poor. In Bohemian villages, women developed a complex system of layered crocks, sauerkraut at the bottom, where temperatures stayed coldest, pickled mushrooms in the middle, fermented dairy at the top for easy access. German abbess Hildegard of Bingen noted how peasant wives could make one cabbage feed 20 through careful lactic fermentation, though she failed to mention the stomach cramps from eating it day after day. The medieval calendar revolved around these preservation cycles. September's blood moon meant slaughtering pigs, the only time salt was plentiful from summer evaporation ponds. October's harvest moon signaled the frantic drying of fruits and grains. By November's frost moon, only the most desperate preservation methods remained, burying turnips in sand, storing nuts in water-filled clay pots, or the notorious hunger bread made from dried and ground tree bark mixed with whatever flour remained. Drying techniques varied by region with heartbreaking ingenuity. Coastal villages strung fish on elaborate seaweed ropes that imparted flavor while preventing flies. Alpine communities built wooden drying towers that captured mountain winds. In marshy Flanders, peasants wove special reed mats that drew moisture from sliced vegetables. Each method represented generations of trial and error, written in the lives of those who starved when experiments failed. The psychological toll of food preservation created its own folklore. Scottish ballads told of the hungry ghost who stole carefully hoarded winter supplies. German children feared her winter, a skeletal figure who counted every poorly preserved berry. French peasant proverbs warned, "A moldy cheese means a weeping wife," the mold being both life-saving penicillin and potential death if it spread to other stores. Storage vessels themselves became prized heirlooms. A well-made butter crock might pass through 5 generations, its interior stained with decades of dairy fats that actually helped preserve contents. Archaeologists find these vessels often buried under hearthstones, not for concealment from thieves, but because the constant warmth prevented freezing that could crack precious containers. The church's role in preservation blended practicality and superstition. Monasteries developed advanced cheese-aging caves, but also hung herbs blessed during rogation days to prevent spoilage. Some saints became associated with specific foods: St. Brigid's butter molds in Ireland, St. Honoré's bread boxes in France, blurring the line between spiritual devotion and food safety. Perhaps most remarkably, these preservation methods created unexpected health benefits. The vitamin C in sauerkraut prevented scurvy in landlocked regions. Fermented dairy provided probiotics long before their discovery. Smoke-cured meats retained more nutrients than modern refrigeration destroys. In their struggle against starvation, medieval peasants accidentally developed what we now call functional foods. As we examine the cookware and implements that made these preservation methods possible, we'll discover another layer of medieval inequality, from the crude wooden troughs of peasant kitchens to the elaborate brass and pewter vessels of noble households, each telling its own story of who got to eat and how well. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through the village as he shaped another crude cooking pot from scrap iron, a sound that meant the difference between hot meals and cold desperation for medieval families. Across Europe, the quality and variety of kitchen implements painted a stark portrait of culinary inequality, where the tools for basic survival became yet another marker of social division. In peasant homes, cooking equipment was brutally functional. Archaeological digs reveal worn-out iron cauldrons patched with lead solder until they resembled metallic quilts. Wooden spoons show teeth marks where starving children had gnawed them during famines. The most common find? So-called slave pots, crude earthenware vessels with rounded bottoms designed to sit directly in coals, their surfaces blackened by centuries of smoke. These pots simmered endlessly with the same thin gruel, their interiors developing a permanent starchy coating that villagers believed held the memory of meals past to flavor new batches. Noble kitchens displayed an entirely different arsenal of cooking technology. The 14th century inventory of the Count of Poitiers lists 12 specialized brass pots for different meats, a rotating spit powered by a trained dog running in a wheel, silver straining spoons with jeweled handles, an ice closet lined with sheep's wool to store winter snow for summer banquets. The contrast extended to tableware. Peasants ate from trenchers, stale bread slices that served as edible plates, later given to the poor or dogs. Nobility dined on neff, elaborate ship-shaped salt cellars that proclaimed their wealth, with some large enough to hold pounds of precious salt. A single noble salt cellar often contained more salt than a peasant family saw in a year. Food preparation spaces revealed equally stark divides. The typical peasant kitchen was just a hearth in a multi-purpose room where livestock also slept. Smoke filled the chamber, preserving meats hanging from rafters, but also damaging lungs. Excavated peasant homes show high concentrations of carbon in skeletal remains, the literal internalization of their cooking environment. Monastic kitchens offered a middle ground with specialized features like herring gutting tables with carved channels for blood runoff, cheese presses using massive stones for weight, grain mills powered by water or blindfolded donkeys to prevent dizziness. These institutions became unexpected hubs of culinary innovation, with monks developing everything from improved butter churns to early pasteurization techniques. The implements told silent stories of their users. A noble's knife might have an ivory handle carved with hunting scenes, while a peasant's knife bore grooves from sharpening until the blade nearly disappeared. Archaeologists find peasant cooking pots with tiny fingerprints pressed into the clay, likely children's hands helping with production, their identities preserved only in these accidental marks. Baking technology followed similar divides. Peasants used simple clay ovens that required entire villages to coordinate baking days, while nobles had brick ovens that could produce delicate pastries. The infamous baker's dozen originated not from generosity, but from strict laws requiring bakers to include an extra loaf in every 12 to compensate for the burnt or undercooked bread inevitable in uneven peasant ovens. Perhaps most poignant are the famine tools found in some peasant homes, specialized implements for processing normally inedible foods. Acorn grinders, bark peelers, and nettle combs speak to the ingenuity of hunger, each representing a family's determination to survive when normal food failed. These crude tools often show signs of repeated repair, having been used across generations of scarcity. As we turn from the implements of cooking to the spaces where food was consumed, we'll discover how medieval dining rooms, from smoky peasant huts to grand baronial halls, reinforced social hierarchies through carefully choreographed rituals of eating and exclusion. The great hall fell silent as the steward struck the floor 3 times with his staff, the signal for the first remove of the evening's feast to begin. Servants emerged from the kitchen in strict procession, their order and pace dictated by centuries of culinary protocol. This wasn't merely dinner service. It was edible theater performed according to an unwritten script that reinforced medieval hierarchy with every carefully timed dish. For the nobility, dining rituals transformed meals into living heraldry. The mise en place of a 14th century banquet followed rules as rigid as any liturgy. Salt cellars positioned to demarcate social boundaries, above the salt for nobility, below for commoners. Servants required to taste each dish before lords, not for poison, but to demonstrate submission. Precisely 13 wine servers for a ducal table, echoing Christ and the apostles. Peasant meals followed their own unspoken codes born of necessity rather than pretension. The order in which family members received portions reflected brutal pragmatism. Working men, whose labor ensured survival. Childbearing women, vessels for future workers. Elderly, who might voluntarily take less. Children, last and least, unless showing exceptional promise. Monastic refectories developed perhaps the most elaborate eating rituals of all. Meals proceeded in absolute silence except for a single reader reciting scripture. Special hand signals allowed monks to request items without speech, a curled finger for bread, a tapping motion for salt. The Benedictine rule specified even how slices of bread should be arranged on the table, like tiles on a roof, to prevent sticking. Table manners became a minefield of social signaling. Nobles cultivated deliberately eccentric eating styles to demonstrate their privilege. The Duke of Berry famously ate only while standing. Countess Maud of Artois employed a servant solely to blow on her soup. King Charles VI insisted on being fed by maidens wearing blindfolds. Meanwhile, peasant dining etiquette focused on survival strategies. Never leave spoon in shared pot, could burn another's hand. Chew each bite precisely 32 times, maximizing nutrition from scarce food. Lick bowls clean, then rinse with water to drink, wasting nothing. The architecture of dining spaces reinforced these divisions. Noble halls featured raised daïses separating ranks of nobility, screens passages concealing kitchen chaos, elaborate lavabo hand-washing stations. Peasant homes arranged everything around the hearth, sleeping benches doubling as seating, shared bowls placed directly on floor, dogs strategically positioned to catch falling scraps. Tableware told its own story of inequality. Excavations show noble sites yield countless broken wine glasses, deliberate destruction to show wealth. Peasant sites reveal carefully mended wooden bowls, passed through generations. Monastic digs uncover puzzle jugs, drinking vessels with hidden holes to temper gluttony. The act of sharing food created unexpected bonds. Guild members celebrated with love feasts, where each contributed ingredients. Villagers pooled resources for harvest suppers. Even nobles participated in symbolic acts of charity. The alms dish at banquets supposedly destined for the poor, though records show most were later fed to hunting dogs. As we conclude our exploration of medieval dining, we turn finally to its legacy. How these centuries of culinary struggle and innovation shaped modern food culture in ways both obvious and surprising, from the spices in our cabinets to the very structure of our mealtimes. The medieval culinary legacy lingers in our modern kitchens like the faint aroma of a long-simmered stew, subtle yet pervasive, its flavors woven into the very fabric of how we eat today. What began as desperate survival tactics in peasant huts and ostentatious displays in noble halls has evolved into dining conventions we now take for granted, the DNA of our food culture carrying echoes of that distant past. Consider the humble sandwich, a direct descendant of the peasant's trencher. That stale bread slice, which once served as both plate and utensil. The modern lunch staple owes its existence to medieval practicality, when Lord Sandwich's famous meat-between-bread creation merely formalized what peasants had done for centuries. Even our plate sizes silently testify to this heritage. Standard dinner plates, 9 to 10 inches, mirror the dimensions of 14th century wooden trenchers, while salad plates, 7 inches, match the smaller potager bowls used for soups and porridges. The three-course meal structure we consider standard emerged directly from medieval service à la Française. What began as entrees to open noble stomachs, literally entrances, pieces de resistance as main displays, issued to table sweet endings, became codified by 18th century chefs into the starter main dessert progression we know today. Even the word dessert comes from the French desservir, to clear the table, just as medieval servants would do before presenting final sweets. Modern food preservation methods are similarly indebted to medieval ingenuity. The FDA approved lactic acid bacteria in our sauerkraut, identical strains to those medieval peasant women cultivated in their clay crocks. Industrial smokehouses used temperature controls perfected in medieval monastic kitchens. Even the trendy fermentation revival movement rediscovers techniques Hildegard of Bingen documented 9 centuries ago. Our dining etiquette carries medieval fingerprints. Knife placement, right side, originated from most peasants being right-handed. The proper soup spoon shape evolved from medieval porridge spoons. Tablecloth use persists from when nobles needed to cover rough wooden tables. Supermarket layouts unconsciously echo medieval market hierarchies. Produce up front, like village greens markets. Butchers in back, separating blood from delicate goods. Bakery smells strategically placed, just as bakeries anchored medieval town squares. Even modern food anxieties trace to medieval roots. Clean eating mirrors monastic fasting practices. Local food movements revive peasant seasonal eating. Gourmet presentation descends from noble subtleties. The medieval legacy manifests most profoundly in our holiday feasts. Christmas dinners preserve the medieval boar's head ceremony. Thanksgiving reenacts harvest home suppers. Birthday cakes with candles? A direct line back to medieval groaning cakes served after childbirth. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval food solutions are addressing modern problems. Peasant crop rotation informs sustainable agriculture. Forgotten grains like spelt meet gluten-free demands. Medieval preservation techniques reduce food waste. As we click order on meal delivery apps or browse supermarket aisles, we participate in a continuum that began with those half-starved peasants and overindulgent nobles. The spices in our cabinets, the structure of our meals, even our table manners, all carry whispers of that distant culinary world. In understanding medieval food's hardships and innovations, we gain not just historical insight, but practical wisdom for addressing today's food challenges, from sustainability to inequality. The circle from medieval hearth to modern kitchen remains unbroken, our plates still bearing the imprint of those who came before us. The medieval spice trade's legacy still tingles on modern tongues, its roots now fossilized in our pantry staples. That pepper grinder on your table? Its contents once traveled farther than most medieval Europeans did in a lifetime, passing through countless hands along routes where men died for a sack of peppercorns. The cinnamon in your morning oatmeal was once so precious, thieves would risk dismemberment for a single stick. These commonplace flavors carry the DNA of global conquest and suffering in their very molecules. Modern food corporations unconsciously replicate medieval spice monopolies. Just as Venetian merchants hoarded pepper supplies in fortified warehouses, today's conglomerates control global vanilla bean distribution from anonymous office parks. The 14th century practice of spiking spices with fillers finds its echo in modern, natural flavoring loopholes. Even the celebrity chef phenomenon began with medieval master cooks like Guillaume Tirel, whose 14th century cookbook, Le Viandier, made him the first culinary superstar. Our restaurant hierarchies descend directly from medieval kitchen brigades. Executive chefs as modern-day master cooks. Sous chefs as the secondaries of old. Line cooks replacing turnspit boys, though thankfully without the actual children. The medieval roots of food service persist in surprising ways. Tipping culture originated with nobles giving veils to servants. Prix-fixe menus descend from noble table d'hôte. Chefs' tasting menus recreate the medieval mess, shared dishes for a group. Even fast food owes debts to the Middle Ages. Burgers inherit the portable nature of medieval pocket pies. Drive-thrus echo the quick service of medieval street vendors. Combo meals mirror peasant plowmen's lunches, bread, cheese, ale. Modern food science is now validating medieval practices. Studies confirm the antimicrobial properties of spice mixes used in meat preservation. Fermented foods' health benefits support peasant preservation methods. The Mediterranean diet essentially rediscovers monastic eating patterns. Our food anxieties and fads replay medieval patterns. Gluten avoidance mirrors the medieval white bread obsession. Organic movement parallels peasant distrust of urban food markets. Farm to table revives the local sourcing nobles took for granted. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval food inequality persists in modern forms. Food deserts replace peasant hunger. Processed foods echo adulterated medieval staples. Celebrity chefs replace noble cooks as culinary elite. As we Instagram our meals or debate dietary choices, we participate in a conversation that began in smoky medieval halls. The distance between a peasant's gruel and a modern smoothie bowl may be smaller than we think, both products of their era's technology, inequality, and creativity. In our search for authentic, ethical, and satisfying food, we're still answering questions medieval people first posed about nourishment's meaning and cost. The medieval table's shadow stretches across contemporary food culture in ways both profound and unsettling. That artisanal sourdough loaf you paid $9 for. Its fermentation process was perfected by 13th century peasants trying to stretch scarce grain supplies. The molecular gastronomy foam gracing Michelin-starred plates? A direct descendant of medieval blanc mange, the airy, almond milk-based dish nobles used to showcase their wealth. Our modern culinary landscape is built upon medieval foundations, layer upon layer like a well-aged strudel. Food, television, and social media have become our new illuminated manuscripts, broadcasting culinary knowledge once confined to monastic scriptoriums where recipes were copied by candlelight, guild halls where cooking techniques were guarded secrets, noble kitchens where master cooks developed signature dishes. The medieval cook's apprenticeship system evolved into today's culinary schools, complete with their own hierarchies and hazing rituals. Where novice cooks once plucked feathers for years before touching a roasting spit, modern students dice onions for months before approaching a chef's station. The medieval masterpiece, an elaborate dish proving one's skill, finds its echo in the modern signature dish required for graduation. Our food festivals and farmers' markets are secularized versions of medieval. Harvest fairs where peasants sold surplus. Saints' Day feasts featuring special foods. Trade fairs showcasing exotic ingredients. Even food criticism has medieval roots. The first restaurant reviews appeared in 14th century Italian city guides rating taverns by quality of bread, from like stone to angels down, wine serving temperature, cleanliness of serving wenches. Modern food transportation networks are just sped-up versions of medieval. Spice routes, now container ships instead of camel caravans. Fish runs, refrigerated trucks replacing salt-packed barrels. Grain shipments, elevators instead of granaries. The medieval legacy persists in our language too. Breaking bread, from communion rituals. Upper crust, from the best part of loaves given to nobility. Proof is in the pudding, from testing food for poison. Our dietary restrictions replay medieval patterns. Vegan diets mirroring Lenten fasting. Paleo diets romanticizing pre-agrarian eating. Gluten-free echoing medieval white bread elitism. Perhaps most telling is how modern chefs have become the new nobility, their restaurants more like medieval courts where reservations replace royal invitations. Tasting menus dictate the experience. Kitchen brigades enforce strict hierarchy. As we swipe through food delivery apps or photograph restaurant meals, we're participating in rituals that would feel strangely familiar to a medieval merchant dining at a Venetian tavern. The plates may be cleaner, the ingredients more varied, but the fundamental human relationship with food remains remarkably unchanged across 8 centuries of culinary evolution. The final course of our medieval culinary journey arrives not with the fanfare of a trumpet, but with the quiet satisfaction of a peasant's modest supper, simple, nourishing, and earned through hard-won understanding. As we wipe our historical knives and fold our metaphorical napkins, the full weight of medieval foodways settles upon us like the gentle dust in a sunlit pantry. What began as an exploration of porridge and spice has transformed into a mirror held up to our own complex relationship with sustenance. Modern food movements reveal themselves as medieval patterns in contemporary clothing. The farm-to-table revolution merely rediscovers peasant seasonal eating. Artisanal cheese-making revives monastic techniques. Foraging trends echo peasant survival strategies. Our dinner tables still perform the same social functions as medieval feasts. Business lunches replace political banquets. Date nights recreate courtly love meals. Family dinners maintain the hearth's central role. The medieval legacy manifests in unexpected modern places. Office coffee stations as secular versions of monastic refreshment. Meal prep Sundays echoing weekly baking days. Food delivery apps digitizing medieval street vendors. Even our food waste issues reflect medieval solutions. Composting reimagines peasant field fertilization. Nose-to-tail cooking revives whole animal use. Preservation techniques combat modern spoilage. The psychological aspects of eating remain remarkably consistent. Comfort food still serves emotional needs. Dieting mirrors religious fasting. Food guilt echoes medieval gluttony concerns. Our restaurants preserve medieval structures. Open kitchens display modern cooking theatrics. Chefs' tables recreate noble dining privileges. Tasting menus continue the remove tradition. The medieval influence extends to food media. Cooking shows secularize culinary knowledge sharing. Food blogs democratize recipe collections. Review sites continue tavern rating traditions. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval food inequalities persist in new forms. Food deserts replace peasant scarcity. Processed foods echo adulterated staples. Celebrity chefs become the new culinary elite. As we conclude this journey from medieval hearth to modern kitchen, we're left with a profound appreciation for how deeply our ancestors' culinary struggles and triumphs have shaped our plates. The spices in our cabinets, the structure of our meals, even our table manners, all carry whispers of that distant culinary world. In understanding medieval food's hardships and innovations, we gain not just historical insight, but practical wisdom for addressing today's food challenges. The circle from medieval hearth to modern kitchen remains unbroken, our meals still nourished by those who came before us. So the next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's a hurried breakfast, a takeout dinner, or a holiday feast, pause for just a moment. That coffee you sip in the morning? Its spices crossed oceans medieval merchants could scarcely imagine. The crusty bread in your basket? Its recipe was perfected by hungry bakers 8 centuries ago. Even the simple act of seasoning your food carries echoes of a time when pepper was worth its weight in gold. We are the fortunate heirs of centuries of culinary struggle and ingenuity. Every bite we take is a testament to those who came before. The peasants who coaxed life from stubborn soil. The cooks who turned scarcity into art. The generations who passed down the radical idea that food could be more than mere survival. Their hunger shaped our abundance. Their resilience built our traditions. And their stories remind us that eating, no matter how ordinary it seems, is never just about food. It's about memory. It's about connection. And above all, it's about the enduring human spirit that turns even the simplest meal into something extraordinary. Until our next journey through history, good night.